Hi everyone and welcome to the Jeff Buller Show. Today I have with me Mark Herschberg. Now, Mark is known for being the author of the Essential Skills, the Career Toolkit actually it's called, the Essential Skills of Success that no one taught you at school. I think that's maybe the little subtext. Now, what's fascinating about Mark is he's gone from tracking criminals and terrorists on the dark web to creating marketplaces and new authentication systems. And Mark has spent his career launching and developing new ventures for startups, including not just the garage startup, but also ones within the Fortune 500s and in academia. He's helped start the Undergraduate Practice Opportunities Program dubbed MIT's Career Success Accelerator, where he teaches annually. At MIT, he received a Bachelor of Science in Physics, so I think he knows his stuff, a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and a Master's in Engineering. Certainly quite science-focused, Mark, which is great because I'm not that scientific, so I'm going to learn a lot today, I'm sure. At Harvard Business School, Mark helped create a platform used to teach finance at prominent business schools, and he's worked with many nonprofits. So, one little thing about Mark that many don't know, we've all been told that white men can't dance, but apparently he's one of the top ranked ballroom dancers in the country. So welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you so much for having me on the show and that lovely introduction.
So I want to talk about a lot of things today. And I suppose this goes back to when did you get an interest in science and when did that start?
For me, I think it really started around age 5. My father had a set of Time Life books. These were a series of books he used to sell in the 70s and 80s. And it was the Mysteries of the Unexplained. Right. So I'd open these books and it would be about the pyramids and Bigfoot and all these interesting things. And I just found it really interesting. And of course, when you talk about the pyramids, you talk about aliens because that's what sells. And it was all fascinating. And I remember when I was 9, my cousin, who was older than me and in high school, he talked about his physics class. And in physics, learning about black holes. And of course, when you get to all the conspiracy theories that you get with pyramids and aliens, eventually black holes somehow pull into it. I thought, oh, this is what relates. Physics somehow relates to all this cool stuff. Mm-hmm. I think that's what crystallized it. But I was always just interested in STEM skills, even as a young kid.
Yeah, and I think certainly we're moving into we're in an age now where it's absolutely critical. What underlies almost any new technology is science, technology, the list goes on. So fast forward, you discovered a love for, what I did like to mention was conspiracy theories, which are alive and well at the moment in the world.
Yes, these were conspiracy theories about history as opposed to about reality.
Yeah, because I've sort of detected there's a lot of parallel universes running at the moment, and everyone's trying to work out which ones are real and which are imagined. But that's part of the fun is you couldn't make this stuff up. So
very true.
So let's fast forward. So you fell in love with science, and then you went and worked. Then went and did your degree at MIT. Tell us about how that happened and your experience there.
I was a classic 1980s nerd growing up. Did all the STEM stuff. I grew up playing competitive chess. Went to MIT and really felt like I found my home. It was a place where nerdiness was celebrated. Now, of course, we celebrate everywhere, Silicon Valley and in common culture. But back then, it was not so common. So MIT was a really great place for me where we could just engage with science and technology and math all around you. And so I really felt at home and enjoyed being there. And I think I got a really solid education in terms of these quantitative skills, in terms of my science and engineering. Although there was definitely something lacking that at the time I didn't understand, but it came back in my 30s when I returned to MIT to help start this program.
Right. And that's you mentioned something to me, which I think is really important for all of us, is that you turn up somewhere and you're going, I feel like I'm home.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think, yeah.
It really just before then never quite felt like I fit in high school. Look at any 80s movie and whatever the nerdy kids were doing, yeah, that was my life. We were off on the side table, we weren't at the cool parties, we were socially shunned, and that's just how it was back then.
Yeah.
And so at MIT, it was for the first time a very different experience.
Yeah, and I think it's very important for all of us to find a place where we feel like we've arrived. Not that we ever arrive, but that it's your place, your safe place where you feel like you belong. And I think that's really important. And it's happened for me in my life too. There's been certain experiences when this just doesn't quite fit, and then you start something and going, this is just fantastic. I belong. And that happened for me when I started my blog about social media. Was this intersection of humanity and technology that social media created. And that's what excited me. I went, okay, so it's not just science, because I'm not a science student, but I love humanity and the soft skills that surround all that. And social media was this intersection of tech enabling humanity, especially back in the good old days of social media. Which I've just written something today about social media today. So I think we're in the middle of very interesting times regarding the role of social, and we're in the middle of a huge social experiment. So the other thing that and I think your timing is really, really good to be on the planet, because you said you felt quite nerdy, and you went to MIT and felt like you're at home. Well, I've heard the phrase, and I think it's true now, is that the geeks shall inherit the earth. It's a little take on a Bible verse. Instead of the meek, it's the geek. It's really, and they are the new cool. I think it's much more celebrated now than it ever was. And you're right. Those that had their heads in books and weren't the cool kids were shunned. So it's great you found your home. So you go to MIT, you do your degree. Did you leave school after that, or did you stay on and do some more education?
I've never fully left MIT. After my undergraduate degrees, I went right into the master's program. After finishing the master's program, at that time, I didn't have a clear career plan. And I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I hid out at MIT for another year as research staff. And so I spent a year at what's now CSAIL, the Computer Science AI Laboratory. After that period, I thought, all right, I really do have to move on. And I did then start going into startups. But even then, I was still very active at MIT with actually the ballroom dancing. I was on the MIT ballroom dance team primarily in my 20s. And it's because it's not a NCAA sport. That's the US Collegiate Athletic Association. Because it's not an NCAA sport, it's flexible about who can be on the team. And MIT takes a very liberal view of who's part of the community. So staff, faculty, alumni are all welcome. So I would still engage and literally be on campus a couple times a week. And then starting in 2000, I helped to start this program at MIT. So I was active ever since, both in the creation of it and then subsequent teaching of it for the past 20 years. So I've never walked away from MIT. There's a part of me that's always there.
Okay, so let's go a little bit into your experiences in the startup scene, because a lot of our listeners do like to learn about that, and I'm slightly selfish. I like to hear a lot about that, frankly. So tell us a little bit about what happens over the next few years as you got involved in startups, both within the garage startup as you described it, and also the basically the top 500 companies that were doing startups as well internally. Tell us a bit about your experiences in that area.
When I came out of school, it was now, and out of that subsequent working at MIT, it was the late 90s. I was in Boston. It's a dot-com era. And that was a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
The blessing, of course, lots of opportunities. The curse is lots of opportunities, and I didn't have a good way to filter on them. So I wound up at a small startup as a couple years old, and wasn't something I was necessarily excited about. It was just, okay, job out of school. In fact, I didn't even know I wanted to do startups. I knew I didn't want to work on Wall Street. I knew I didn't want to do big tech, which in those days was Microsoft, IBM.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I didn't want to do consulting. So this was kind of the default option. And I joined, and I was very lucky. I had a really wonderful manager there and began to learn skills that I hadn't learned in school. Primarily, those were programming skills, because of course, for those of us in tech, a lot of schools teach computer science, which is not quite the same as software engineering.
Mm.
And for those who haven't done it, think of it this way. When you come out of, let's say, mechanical engineering program, and so you learned, okay, I understand how an engine works. I understand the basic mechanics, what a lathe is. I understand force multiplication. But would you actually take someone who's just out of school and say, go design the next car? Right? Because building a car, yes, it's mechanical, but it's a whole scale that you really haven't focused on. You just know some of the fundamentals. And in software, the same is true. But back in the 90s, there were so few people that had any level of experience because the field was just blowing up. It was a lot of kind of new people just leading other new people, and no one really having a lot of deep experience as a practitioner. So I got lucky. I did find someone who had been doing it for a while. I learned a lot of great skills from my manager and from some other folks. And the moment that really got interesting is that company, the founders have falling out, which turns out surprisingly common. I've seen it at many, many companies. And they split in two. So the CTO called me to his office one day and said, this might be a surprise or maybe not, but I'm leaving. Love for you to come with me. I've already got these folks coming with me. And the other founder said, okay, he's leaving. We'd love for you to stay. I said, all right, I guess I have to make a decision. Because till this point, I had never even thought about my career. It's just, I'm here. It's okay. I code. It's nice. I get money. And I started to think, what do I need to do? Like, what makes this interesting? How do I pick between the two? And then I realized I had more than two choices. This was still the .com era. This is now 99. And so I started to think about how do I evaluate what's important, and then wound up joining another startup that I felt was the right fit for me. Now this startup, this was closer to the garage level startup. It was 5 MIT students. They were literally in someone's living room when I met them. And they had some early code. But of course, at this time, you can say, we're from MIT, please give us money. And a VC had given them a few $1 million. So now by age 26, 27, I was a senior experienced person. And so I joined to start leading the team. And we grew that company. We sold it despite the .com crash and everything falling apart. Had a successful exit in the fall of 2000. And that put me on the path to doing lots of different startups. And I realized this is what I love to do.
Yeah, it's sometimes the journey is very winding, isn't it? It's really, and you don't know what you don't know. And that's the challenging part in life, is trying to work out, where do I feel at home? And I think this one term we've discussed is, where do you feel like you belong? And I think you've got to listen to, and Steven Spielberg described it beautifully. He said, what you should be doing on this planet will come at you as a whisper, it will not shout. And I think that is just so true. And that it's the terms used for this are intuition, but it certainly is a whisper. That's what I've discovered. And you can rush right by that if you're not careful. So you got the whisper, which was, you felt at home as, in the tech science area. You started programming. Excuse me. So what happened next? You're in this startup. They exited. Where'd you go from there?
When we exited, I was part of the larger company for a while and felt this wasn't really a good fit for me anymore. At that point, I talked to some of my mentors, and it's interesting you talk about this whisper, because I had gotten a whisper that it led to this parallel path. So from here on out, there's two real paths for me. And we'll talk a bit about about my career doing other startups, and then also the parallel educational track. So I'll talk about that whisper, but then go back to the startup track.
Absolutely.
So at this point, I had been doing a bunch of hiring. I hadn't had a lot of formal training, but one thing I noticed when I was hiring, I'd ask candidates a technical question and they'd give me a technical answer. I go, okay, great, you took the class. In fact, they were all seemingly taking the very same class. There weren't a lot of software engineering classes at the time. This is about 2000. So I'd ask them kind of the same question, no matter what university. I knew what they had learned. I got the answer. But then I would ask questions like, what makes someone a good teammate? How do you recognize a good leader? And I would get blank stares
Mm.
because they were never taught this. And I realized I was never taught this either, but I had taken interest in starting to learn some of these skills. And it's only because I put forth that effort that I had any idea what the answer should be or could be. And this was an interesting challenge. And I was trying to find training programs to help build these skills, and I couldn't find anything. So I left to do a few things. One, to write a book that I ultimately wrote and never published for various reasons. Two, at the time, I heard MIT was trying to put together a course, and it was kind of along these lines. So these were the whispers coming to me, hearing the challenges, hearing MIT's doing this. So I reached out and said, I've been dealing with these issues and looking at them for a while. Can I help with this class? They said yes, and so I came on to help them design, and they said, we'd love for you to help teach it. And that led down that path. But on the career side and startup side, talking to my own mentors, what we had decided, I was pretty solid on my technical skills by this point. And I had been lucky somewhat. I got into Java software engineering. I started in 1996 when it was still in beta. So I kind of rode the wave. Even though I wasn't the most experienced software engineer, very few people had more Java experience than I did. And this, for anyone interested in technology, the great thing is every few years there's some new technology that comes out. And if you get in early, you get an edge because it's hard to find people with 3-5 years experience, but you were one of the few because you started early on.
Mm.
So I developed very solid technical skills, but I felt I still wasn't as strong on these other skills as I should be. And so what my mentors had suggested is I should start doing consulting because that's going to give me a chance to pick different opportunities that will build up these skills. So I wound up doing this project at HBS. It was partially technology and partially creation of this class. I wound up doing consulting, going into different companies that were just struggling and having problems and helping them fix it. And again, there were some technology challenges, but very often, and this is true in general in technology, the hardest part isn't the technology, it's the people. And it's the communication, the process, the understanding of what you're building, personality conflicts. And so officially I was there for technology, but I really was solving a lot of people issues as well.
And at the end of the day, it's very much about people, isn't it? So you've got to build the core fundamentals, but then you've got to learn how to sell your product to people. You've got to learn to market it to people. And then you've got to work on teams as people together to work together and make things happen. So you mentioned that, let's take a little aside here. So tracking criminals and terrorists on the dark web. With a recent hack that was been announced recently, tell us a little bit about your experiences in tracking criminals and terrorists on the dark web. I'm intrigued.
My graduate work at MIT was in cryptography. So I've been trained in this. My graduate thesis, what I often get asked about, my thesis was secure electronic voting over the World Wide Web. So every 4 years, I get a lot of questions on it. Short answer on that, we should never be voting online. Paper ballots are the way to go. But I began with cybersecurity. At the time, the cybersecurity options were limited in the 90s. You could work for those big tech companies I didn't want to do, or work for the government, which I also looked at but didn't want to do. And there weren't a lot of cybersecurity startups. So I didn't pursue that early on. But as we got to the last 10 years or so, cybersecurity startups became more common. And I got back into it. Now, this particular company, it was started by someone who was basically looking on the dark web. The dark web, for those who aren't familiar with it, this is the web that is basically inaccessible. Part of the dark web, it's not so scary. The dark web is your bank account information that Google can't index. We don't want them to, right? It's behind a login. But then other parts of the dark web are things like sites on Tor. You need a different type of browser to get, or you need password access to get into a forum. And I always explain to people, the dark web itself isn't scary. It's not that a dark alley is necessarily scary, but if you're going to be doing something scary, like mugging someone, you're probably going to do it in the dark alley and not out on the street. So not all the dark web is bad, but when bad things happen online, it's usually in the part of it that's the dark web. And so we built a system that would go into these places in the dark web and start to gather information, gather who the people are, what they're thinking of doing, how they're interacting, the tools that they're using. And we gathered this information, which then got sold to our corporate customers as well as government customers. And they use that in terms of their own threat analysis and security planning.
Yeah, it's certainly a big area, and I like your mention of using paper ballots instead of computer voting, because I suppose the thing about computers is that if there is an issue, it certainly can be done at scale, where it's very difficult to do it at scale with paper ballots. So I think that's a great point. So I'm going to do a little bit of a side here, because it's something that's popping up more and more in the conversations I'm having, and you're especially with you in the technical area and business area. It's the increasing role of AI in our businesses and in our lives as humans. And AI is getting involved in marketing, approvals of ads, what's seen in the algorithms. What's your take on where we are with artificial intelligence at the moment?
Well, that's a big open question. And of course, artificial intelligence, we talk about AI in certain specific areas versus the general intelligence that can replicate a human. I'm going to focus more on the former. Now, AI, if you haven't worked in the field, it conjures up all sorts of ideas about very sophisticated algorithms. AI can be as simple as a basic if statement. Right? If the person's test score is over this amount, put them in a certain class or give them a certain medication. And if it's below, don't do that. That technically is a form of AI. It's really trivial, but it is. Now, you say, well, we can do better. Yes, we could get, multiple if statements, and then we can get rule sets that could be hundreds and then thousands and hundreds of thousands of rules. They get more and more complicated. So we have to look at, given the state of technology, what is AI bringing to us? What can it do? AI today, I look at as the early robotics revolution. So starting in the 1960s and really in the 70s and 80s, if you were doing mechanical labor, turning a screw, we said, look, the robots are coming along, they're going to replace you, right? And we know manufacturing got decimated by robots that could do repetitive tasks. What robots can't yet do is higher end labor work. And we see today in the US a shortage of actually that skill set of higher end labor. Now, what's happening with AI? AI can do some basic things. When you had a 23-year-old who would look at a marketing campaign and say, oh, I'm running 3 campaigns, this one's doing well, these 2 not so much. Well, let's put more money into the one that's doing well.
Yep.
Okay, a 6-year-old can figure that out. You didn't need the 23-year-old. And so we can start to create rules that replicate that. We can also use what's called AI, can just do things like some presumptive guesswork. So in law, for example, a lot of lawyers, a lot of their time is just spent looking at cases, right? And okay, you have an issue, let me go look at case law. Let me go find what's relevant. Well, if you can get some AI that can just do some pattern matching, just say, based on the words you've entered, here are the most relevant cases. Now, instead of the lawyer looking at 25 cases to find the relevant 3, they might only look at 8. And so that's AI. So what we're seeing is AI is doing the more mechanical parts of our task, and it's freeing up time to do more. So to everyone who's fearful about AI is going to steal my job, there's a handful, right? Just like toll booth collectors, they're gone, right? We used to have them growing up. I'd have to stop every few miles to pay the toll booth on the Jersey Turnpike. No more. On the other hand, we have a whole bunch of other jobs like social media people. They didn't exist when I was paying my way through the toll booths. So as AI continues to grow, it's going to take away the more rote mechanical tasks that we do and free up time where we can do higher order tasks. If you as an individual are focused just on those rote skills, you're going to be in trouble. But if you continue to advance your career and the value that you bring in your company as an employee, or that your company brings to other organizations, then you've got opportunity, and we'll continue to create new opportunity as each mechanical piece goes away.
Yeah, I think you made a really valid point, is that humans are going to move on to more creative pursuits and be freed up from the industrialization of the office, which we've had in the past, after the industrialization of the factory. And I'm not afraid of the robot, because I really believe as humans we're meant to be creators, not meant to be machines. And AI is going to help us to redefine ourselves. And one of the challenges I have heard is the biggest challenge we have in society is we need to help people re-educate. And who has that role? Is it government? Is it corporate? Is it yourself? In terms of reinventing yourself. And that's a big challenge for a lot of people, is reinventing themselves. So they, excuse me, so they don't get replaced by a robot, which is just going to take away their boring job that they most really hate at any rate. But we need to skill them up. So what do you think about that area of skills in terms of helping people move to their next, reinvent themselves?
You've now hit on a very passionate subject for me. When we look historically, we'll take the US, for example. Over a 100-year period, we went from being a 75% agrarian society to 25%. So 75% of the population were farmers, and 100 years later, only 25%. And we know today it's even smaller. And when we think about that, grossly, we think, well, this is a good thing. When 75% of the population was just farming and they weren't very productive, we didn't have people to go be in factories or to be social media managers and do all this other stuff we benefit from. So as we removed them from farming, because farming became more productive, and so fewer farmers can feed more of us, we freed them up to deliver more value. Now, acutely, there were certain farmers who said, my farm is going under, this is bad, right? And they had a bad time. As we had this mass migration take place over 100 years, it happened literally over generations. And so some farms failed each year, but it was a small enough number that we said, not good, but we as a society could handle that many farmers losing their jobs, and their children would go on and pick other professions that delivered more value. We've seen with the blue-collar workforce in factories, we saw factories peak mid-century in the US and start to decline. And there again, it's happened over a faster period, and we've certainly seen cases where town, they lose a factory and they lose a lot of jobs, and it hits an economic impact. What's happening, what we've all seen with technology, it accelerates the pace of change, right? How quickly change hits us. And one of the fears that we have as a society is driverless cars, because the belief is that if a driverless car comes out, and I'm going to pick 2030. I'm actually probably less optimistic than most people on driverless cars, but let's pretend it 2030, we say, great, we've proven it works. All the laws are in place, we're ready to go. The first one rolls off the factory for public use. Within about 5 years, maybe 10, we've now replaced the majority of rideshare drivers, of truck drivers, maybe even some bus drivers. And so now over not multiple generations, not over decades, but over a few years, millions of people get displaced. And that's something that our society can't handle as easily. Now, I picked rideshare as an example, but we're going to see this, of course, in different areas. We're going to see, we'll take lawyers as an example. I mentioned that before. If now lawyers, instead of looking at 25 cases, only look at 8, maybe only look at 5, if some of the writing that they do can be automated or some of the checking, we suddenly need less lawyers for what we do. What happens to all these people who spend $100,000 getting a law degree? We have to find ways to take people in society as we do these transitions, as their whole industry shifts and the jobs are not coming back. We as society have to invest in retraining them for other skills. And it's not quite as simple as, oh, go learn to program. I hear there are programmers, or there's a need for that. it has to align to what their interests are, their geography, where they're based, what skills they can bring over from where they were. I helped do some of this in 2010. New York City's Economic Development Council funded a program because we saw lots of people displaced in the Great Recession, and we knew their jobs weren't coming back. In fact, one of the other big challenges, when you had someone who had been working at, for example, Citicorp, a company of 30,000 people, and now we're getting them a job at a startup of 30 people, there's even a cultural shift. They're very used to, okay, well, let's have the pre-meeting before we have the meeting with legal to get the approval so we can consider doing this 6-month project. When you're in a company of 30 people, you go, hey, Bob, what about doing this? Bob says, yeah, I like it. Let's do it. That was it. That was your 6-month cycle down to a 6-second conversation. But that's a cultural shift. It's not about any formal education or training. It's a cultural shift that they might not be used to. So to handle all this, to go to your question, who's responsible? Well, first, the individual. We always have to take responsibility for our careers because no one's more committed to them than us.
We do.
But second, I think we do have to get some help from the government, federal, state, at a societal level. And it's not just about, okay, money for programs. It's about things like, what if we have a standard practice that every 10 years, you go back to school for 6 months? That's your macro training. You'll continue to learn each year, but maybe it's normal to go to school for 6 months. Do we have some type of loan program to help offset that tuition? That might be something that's state funded. And then of course our schools themselves have to have different types of educational programs that are more for a lifetime of continual learning and not you're 22 and done. Best of luck. Please remember to give us a donation. It has to be a lifetime engagement.
What do you think? There's one that you didn't mention, but I'm sure you have some ideas about. What's the role of the corporation in terms of retraining and looking after its staff?
I have my opinion that I don't think is always shared. My opinion is corporations do owe that obligation to their employees, but we have to put this in context. Certainly there's a trend that people are thinking today people tend to change jobs more often. It's not quite true. It's a little more often. It's not quite the same as, not a big leap from what it used to be, but that people are disposable. We see more contract workers, so it's not about investing in them. But in fact, I see it as an opportunity. If you know you're hiring someone, let's just assume they're going to be there 3 or 4 years. That's on the shorter sides. The data I've seen puts it closer to 5, but let's even say 2 to 3 years. Okay, can that investment in them pay off in that time frame? So you're not sending them to some 2-year MBA program, but you can give them some training that can have an ROI within that time frame. But also this should be seen both by the employer and candidate as part of their compensation. And I always emphasize this with my students when people say, oh, I want to get good compensation, I want to get good money. They talk about salary, maybe bonus, maybe stock options, but you have to look at other parts of it, not just vacation. It's about what training are you going to get, whether formal training from the company, sending you to programs, or even just informal, what will I learn from the job? And when both sides see this, now companies can say, we're delivering more value to you when you work here. You're getting more out of it. That will make them more attractive to candidates. Candidates, especially if it's a program that's working and helping them, will be more engaged with the company, will want to stay with that company longer. And the candidates themselves obviously get the benefit from learning. So I think corporations can be smart about this and can use this opportunity. We can think of it as micro learning, right? Short-term training, formal or informal, to help develop the skills, and everyone's going to be better off.
I think you made some really good points there. And the other thing that I've come across recently was just doing corporate training for employees can increase retention as well as increase profitability. And we're not talking 5 or 10%. I've heard numbers like 100% increase in profitability by those that train their staff. So and retraining is part of that, definitely. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to segue into your career toolkit. You've got 3 sections here. So the career toolkit, which you've titled the subtitle, Essential Skills for Success That No One Taught You. And I would totally agree, being an ex-teacher, is that, I was a high school teacher, and the essential skills for life were quite often just completely missed at school. You learn how to do maths, you learn how to do English. And what's your communication skills like? Pass. That would be, there was just not done. So you discussed 3 areas. Number 1 is career planning. The section 2 is leadership and management. And the third section is interpersonal dynamics. So let's have a quick look at section 1, career and career planning. What are the sort of like key things that you should be doing in this space? And I certainly have some thoughts in that career planning is quite often just accidental. Sometimes it's experiential. Sometimes you have a very clear vision because at a 5-year-old you knew you were going to play the violin, but that doesn't happen very often. So tell a bit about what you see in this first section of your toolkit, the role of career planning and some of the essential things that you need to be thinking about.
Sure. In chapter 1, I talk about how to actually create a career plan. And to your point, there's a handful of people who've known since they were 5 what they want to do. Most of us were exploring and revising. And one of the most important pieces of this, it's not about saying, this is my plan and I'm rigid, I'm fixed to it. Mm-hmm. It's about saying, here's my plan and I'm going to adjust along the way. You can almost think of it like a vacation. You say, okay, I'm going to go over to Europe. I'm going to spend 3 weeks touring these different cities and I want to hit these museums. But maybe you find you're really enjoying some cities, so you want to extend it a few days. Or you didn't really like that art museum. Maybe you're done with art museums and you want to do something different for a bit. So you can and should revise it along the way. And so I talked about beginning with what are the questions that will help you think about what you want to do. And you think about them ideally not just today, but in the future. And using these questions, you can start to think about what jobs might be of interest. And you can map out paths to get there. And of course, when you create these plans, it says, this is where I want to be in 5 years. By just checking in maybe once a year and getting help from your mentors, from your friends, from HR even, you might adjust that plan along the way. But the key point is that simply hoping you'll wind up where you want to be is less likely to lead to success than if you have a plan. The plan doesn't guarantee success, but it makes the odds more likely. And if you don't like where you're going, throw it out, adjust it along the way.
So what you're really saying is that setting a hard goal is not the best way to do it. It's maybe you're setting a direction or intent of a possibility of something that you might enjoy.
General Eisenhower once said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And even the act of doing this, of thinking about these questions, will help. To go back to what I mentioned earlier, when I had that choice between staying with, as a company split in two, following my CTO or staying with the company, I started to say, how will I evaluate this? I came up with a list of questions. What do I want to have a job? What's helpful? Where am I going? And once I could answer those questions, I could evaluate which job was right for me and then realize option C that I hadn't even considered before, I should go look for something that's more in line with this. Yeah. So the act alone of planning, even if you don't say this is where I want to be. And by the way, the where I want to be, for some people, that's, I want to be chief of medicine. For other people, it's, I think I want to be doing something where I'm leading some type of business development-ish. I don't know the title or the industry. So it could just be certain skills or practices you want to do. It could be as concrete or as vague as you want. But that discussion you have in your head or with your friends, that's what's going to help you figure out where you want to go.
Yeah, I think you made some great points there. And what I've discovered along the way in that context is, and I'd be interested in your feedback on this as well, in terms of your career toolkit and your experience as well from life, because we learn a lot from life, not just academic exposure. When I was teaching, I went and did a bit of part-time selling at night, and I discovered I was quite good at it and enjoyed it. And in fact, I made more money in 2 nights a week selling than I did from my entire week of teaching. So there's a message there somewhere. So I changed to a new school, moved to a different city, and at the end of that year, I knew that I had to leave teaching. It was just, I did not feel at home. I didn't feel like I belonged. It was just a place that was a journey, just a stopping point along the way of life. So what I did is this is an experiential thing regarding the planning, is that you have an idea, a plan that maybe I'm thinking to myself, the whisper was, maybe I should try some sales. So I went and tried 3 sales jobs just without pay, stepped in for a few days into these. One was life insurance selling, one was real estate selling, and the other one was selling technology. And it was in the middle of the PC revolution where Steve and Bill were duking it out, mid 1980s. And I went, so what did I do? I went, I know which one I feel most comfortable with, and I chose the technology path, and pretty well not left it apart from a few distractions along the way. But what do you think the role of low risk experiential testing of testing, I suppose, soft testing of your plan?
I'm a big fan of it. In a great book, Range by David Epstein, in one of the chapters, he talks about how people actually do this. Many people will try out lots of different things early on, not in a conscious planning way, but they'll try things and quickly discard. And this, it turns out, from a game theory standpoint, is the most efficient way to learn. I recommend to my students when they say, I'm trying to figure out what internship I should do, I tell them, well, look, if you're 90% set on Wall Street, maybe just do 1 or 2 jobs in a startup or in big tech or consulting. Try something you think you're not going to like. Because if you don't like it, you go, yep, tried it, don't like it. You'll learn from not liking it. You'll realize, what is it you don't like about it? I don't like that it's not structured. I don't like that the office is, someone's spare bedroom, whatever it is you don't like. Great, you've learned. And now it's harder to do that when you're 30 to say, I want to try something. So early in your career, try things, and try even things you're not certain of, because that makes it easier when you commit. Or, you can try a thing you commit, but don't do that, say, all 3 summers if you're a student. Now, as an adult, we don't always have the opportunities for internships. And that, by the way, is something I think we need to fix as society as well. We need to have some type of internship program. I mentioned the program the Economic Development Council funded. We actually worked with companies to do internships for people in their 30s, 40s, 50s.
Yeah.
If you get that experience and see what fits. But even if you can't do that, you can find ways to try things out. You mentioned doing some free work. You might be able to find a friend who has a small business or a startup and say, can I help out? Volunteer work is a great way to do it. I'm a fan of Taproot. Taproot does projects where you and I can both create sandwiches at a food line, but I can do certain things in technology. You can do certain things in social media and technology that are different from each other. And so they take whatever your particular domain skills are and apply them. And so you can find projects where you start to get experience doing things that can go on your resume. It does count, but also get you exposure. And then to your other point, we learn so much from life, but it doesn't have to be our own life. Certainly go out and talk to other people. Ask them, what do you like about your job? What don't you like? If you were entering the field, what do you wish you knew? And listen for things that sound exciting or disappointing, and start to look for patterns.
Yeah, I totally agree. Now, you mentioned the company Taproot. How's it
Taproot
spelled?
is a nonprofit here in the United States. I don't know if they're international.
Right.
But with Taproot, you can sign up. And for example, if you wanted to get into, let's say, graphic design, Taproot would have a project where they say, we have to rebuild a website for this nonprofit. They've come to us. So they'll get someone who has, say, HTML skills, someone who has copy skills, someone who can project manage, and they'll need someone to do the design, the look and feel. It's like, great, here's our team. Each of you do your part, and over a few months, you build the website for them. And now you can say, look, I built this website. I've done some design. Here's proof of it, or here's what I've done. Now I love it, or realize this is not for me, and go find something else.
So how do you spell Taproot? Is it TAPROOT.com?
.org.
.org.
Taproot, yeah, taproot.org.
So taproot.org.
Yes.
I think it's great. And that raised another point you mentioned before, internships. Now in Australia, we can't have internships unless we pay them. In America, I think internships can be free. In other words, you can volunteer. Is that correct?
The law's gotten kind of fuzzy over the years. It changes. My understanding, and this comes with the I am not a lawyer or an accountant,
Okay.
you used to be able to take them without paying them if they could get some credit, some school credit.
Okay.
But I don't know where the law stands these days. Now,
Yeah.
realistically, as an adult, many of us have said, oh, hey, my buddy has a startup, let me go give him some help, right? I'll give him a couple hours a week. I don't think the IRS is going to come down on you,
No.
Unofficially helping out your friend for a number of weeks. It's more when someone's showing up to the office where you don't have that personal relationship.
Yeah. Now, something fascinating that you mentioned before that I'd like to dive into a little bit more. You mentioned doing internships as 30, 40, and 50-year-olds. Now, internships are typically thought of as college students, 20-somethings. And I think that this area of internships, whatever you want to call it, where 30, 40, 50-year-olds, because in the middle of this huge fast change in the middle of, and I think the pandemic has certainly accelerated. I think the pandemic's accelerated the change of society and business by about 10 years. It might be 8, it might be 5, it might be 15. I don't know, but it has accelerated change. We definitely know that. How we work, our business does business, how we live, where we work, the list goes on and on. So the role of a 30, 40, 50 sort of internship where suddenly you're 20 years in, the role or the job you did, one, you might hate it, two, it's starting to disappear. And I think the reinvention. So what do you think about the role of a 30, 40, 50-year-old being involved in internships, whatever we want to call it, to help them reinvent their lives to move on to the next chapter of what they love doing? And Taproot's one, obviously, way of doing it, which I'm going to do a little bit more research on because it sounds fascinating. So what do you think about 30, 40, 50-somethings doing internships?
We're using a term internship broadly because there's lots of ways you can imagine this being done. One of them certainly is you do go back for some program. Certainly we know MBAs, when you do a 2-year MBA program, you have an internship in that middle year. Or if you're doing law school, you get summer internships. And it doesn't matter what your age is. For many people, it's late 20s, early 30s. But no one's looking at your age. They're saying you're in school, you do an internship. That's natural. What if our society moved to you do these 6-month programs roughly every 10 years or so in your career, and at the end of this 6-month program, it's normal to do a 2-month internship. Doesn't even have to be summer oriented, just at some point you work with a company and spend 2 months doing a project with them. It might be just more project-based work, that there's this expectation, understanding of, okay, you're going to do a almost try before you buy. Here's some 40-year-old that's doing a career change. Company's not sure about their background. The person might not even be sure about, is this what they want to do? But they do a 2-month project, and now both sides can feel each other out. I'd say one of the key differences, internships for college and somewhat for high school students, those are seen as part of the recruiting pipeline. For many companies, big companies do say, yeah, we know how to get value. For many companies, the mentality is get a net zero value. You just hope the interns don't suck up more time from your staff
That's right.
than the value they create. And you're okay with a net zero value because what you're doing is building a recruiting pipeline. And if you haven't thought about it this way, there's a great book, Recruit or Die, by my friend Chris Resto, that talks about how to think about building a college recruiting pipeline. And so this is one way to do it. And your interns are there so that you can start to capture people as they come out of college. When you're thinking about interns who do have experience in their 30s or 40s, you might think more about, well, they should be able to deliver some value. It might not be as much as someone who's been doing exactly this for years, but you're not going for that net zero. You're going for net positive to some level to see if it's enough of a fit that they're close enough, you invest a little more time in them, they start the job, they're going to get to where you need them to be. But this can also be seen as part of your recruiting pipeline. I know some companies, their recruiting process is in software. Pair programming is big. So in pair programming, two programmers sit literally side by side and work on the code together. And they will say, our interview is you're going to come in for a day and pair program with a couple different people. And by the way, we'll pay you. We're asking you to spend a day doing work. We'll pay you for this. So you can take that idea and just expand it out to weeks or months.
Yeah, I think that's some great ideas in that, and helping people reinvent their lives. The other part of that equation is not only just if you're looking at reinventing yourself or moving on to the next part of your life and career, is that quite often it happens that not only do you suddenly discover something you love doing that you never knew about, and you quite often don't discover that unless you do it. Thinking about it's one thing, doing is another. I think if you go in and do an internship or do a side hustle, is the other term that's used, is that sometimes that turns into a business opportunity, and it certainly did for me, in that I went down a certain route, which is in the technology route. Then I just started creating some information and content, and that just passion project side hustle, which was a part of reinventing myself at the age of 50, turned into a business opportunity. And I think that's the other exciting part of it. It could be a new career path, or it could be a business entrepreneur path. And you just don't know how it's going to pan out. But I think tapping into the power and energy that comes from doing what you're meant to be doing is certainly very important.
That's in some ways how I wound up here. When I reached out to MIT to say, hey, I hear you're doing this class on these topics. I'm passionate about them. How can I help? That's literally what I said, just how can I help? And that led to, let me help you do the coursework, to why don't you come and teach? And I've been teaching for 20 years. I didn't set out to write this book. I set out actually to do just a couple notes for the class. But what I thought was going to be a 20-page pamphlet turned out to be an entire 300-page book. Along with, I include things that aren't taught in the class, and some of the things in class weren't appropriate for the book. But it was certainly, it influenced the book. And then even with the book, I wound up building an app to help reinforce the lessons of the book. So one challenge I have is that I read a book, I say, oh, wow, so many great ideas, and then you forget it 2 weeks later. So I built an app that basically uses spaced repetition that will pop up each day just as a little alert on your phone, one of the points from the book. And so as you read it, you'll help remember it. Now, that's not something I planned on building. I thought this would be useful. I figured someone else built it. So I'll just go license that, and it'll be a nice thing to come with the book. That doesn't exist. So I couldn't find it. I wound up patenting the approach to doing it, building the software, building a white label version. Maybe that's going to turn into a side hustle for me, so to speak, because I've had other authors say, wow, how do we use this for our book? And even some corporate learning and development teams say, for corporate training, we'd love to do that to help reinforce what people get in our classes. So I had no plans when I said to MIT, how can I help, that I would write a book or build an app, but one thing does lead to another, to your point.
I think there's a real magic when you take an idea, do it, and then share it. I think that's where certainly the rubber really hits the road, is when you take, does this idea really work in the real world? Or is it just a crazy idea that's not going to get any traction? What's the name of the app?
The app is called the Career Toolkit.
Okay.
So it goes with the book. If you go to the website, you can find it on both the Android and Apple Store. If you go to my website, thecareertoolkitbook.com, and you click on the app tab, you can find links to both the app and the Apple and Android store.
I will pass that along to our readers and listeners and viewers, and I'm going to check it out as well. So the next two sections, number one, leadership and management and interpersonal dynamics, come down to, and this is something you discovered, is that you interviewed a lot of people for startups in your role, and you discovered that they could answer the hard skill questions. But when it came down to soft skills, which is, I'm putting those in those leadership management and interpersonal dynamics into the soft skills box. Tell us a bit about Section 2, leadership and management, and a couple of important areas there that people need to consider.
When I looked at this section, there's of course no shortage of books on all of these topics, right? You have many, many books just on a single one of these topics. What I focused on was really the fundamentals. It's not about this leadership theory or that one, or this management process or that one. What are the fundamental pieces that are true throughout all these different theories and approaches? And one of the most important things, especially with maybe some of your younger listeners, a lot of people I found in the workplace say, well, I'm looking forward to being a leader once this happens, once I become a director, once I get the promotion, once I have a managerial title. And their mind is set to positional leadership, that your leadership comes from your role. And so one of the most important things that you can recognize is leadership can be influential. It doesn't matter where you're seated at the table. Influence is about putting forth an idea and getting people to follow it. And that is the essence of leadership. And that's what I talk about in the book, is how you can use this type of leadership no matter where you are in the organization or in your career. Likewise, in the management chapters, I break that down into people management and some process management, some tools. Something that we miss, and even a lot of process books, we miss this. Simple things like recognizing different people have different motivations. Some people are motivated. You tell them, look, you do this, you get a big bonus. And they say, great, let me add it. Other people, they go, but this is a challenging job. Even some people are motivated by the camaraderie of going to their office, of being part of something, of the mission. So recognize that you can't use the same carrot for everyone when you're motivating them. And again, you can read entire books on the different ways to do this, but even simply having this understanding, and this is one of the themes throughout the book, is that a lot of these things, once you recognize that something is a little more complicated, isn't just a simple box, isn't a binary, I'm leading or I'm not, you suddenly see opportunities. Once you recognize, well, not everyone is motivated the same way, what happens next? All of a sudden you start to see, as we have this discussion, I realize Jane's really motivated by the mission and Steve is really motivated by money. And you might have missed that before, but now you're open to seeing it, and you can continue the development on your own because you recognize the lessons and opportunities all around you.
I think that's great. And I think what you've mentioned there is, I would encapsulate it as being aware. And we all quite often just stumble through life, not seeing but not looking, or looking but not seeing. And that's one thing that I've certainly tried to work on over the years, is building personal awareness. And I think this comes down to the third section you talked about, interpersonal dynamics, which I think you go a lot stronger into communication. Tell us a bit about what you think is important in this section, interpersonal dynamics.
So this is broken down to 4 chapters: communication, networking, negotiation, and ethics. And these are just fundamental skills that are going to underpin everything you do, whether you're an entrepreneur or an individual contributor, no matter where you are, even outside of the workplace. These are key skills. And again, you start to recognize when you learn negotiations, most people think, well, negotiations, it's where I'm sitting across the table from you and we're negotiating my salary or a vendor contract. And that is a negotiation, but it's also when you're sitting around the conference room table and you're working out who's working on what pieces of this, or which departments are going to be responsible for what. That's a negotiation. Your boss asking you to stay late and you wanting to have a little more flexibility, that's a negotiation. And once you start to recognize this, you see more opportunities to negotiate, or different ways to communicate, or different ways to build your network. And you can continue to enhance your abilities that are going to help you inside the office and out.
I think you made some fantastic points there in terms of sort of being aware by listening skills, communication skills. I went and did a course for 6 months. It was done once a week. It was like it was part of a counseling course, actually. And it's the essence of it was to create if you're going to be a good communicator, number one, you've got to start with self-awareness, how you come across. And then from that, if you are more aware of yourself and how you communicate, do you annoy people? Do you not listen enough? Do you, all of the above? And that leads on to then being more aware of others. If you're self-aware, then you can take the next step and be much more aware of others, because you can stand back and going, oh, I didn't know I was like that. And then you tend to be a little bit kinder on others as well, I think, in terms of, well, they're motivated by a different thing to me. They come from a different culture. Something's much more important to them than others. And what I'm thinking is not right or wrong. It just, we have different views.
That's why I touch on the communication chapter. And here again, you can read 100 different books that look at 100 different ways. But one of the fundamentals of communication is exactly what you're saying. We all come with certain perspectives. And once you begin to recognize we have different perspectives and how to identify that perspective, you suddenly begin to learn how I can communicate to put it into a perspective that resonates with you, or to communicate the idea in a way that fits into the framework of your perspective. Now, one of the things that's true of all of these, you talk about this class where it's listening with other people. These skills are all very different than hard skills in terms of how we learn them. So when I wanted to learn physics, it was pretty easy. The professor sat there and wrote a whole bunch of equations on the board, and we memorized them and tried to learn them. Occasionally we'd ask each other clarifying questions. But for something like leadership, there's no simple equation. There's no, this is it. Learn this, now you know how to be a leader. Here's the 3-step process for networking. It's a mindset, and there's more than one answer. There's more than one perspective, as you brought up. And so these skills are best learned in peer groups. Now, we see this in business school when they have classes on leadership. They do so not by pure lecture, they have discussion groups. And they bring in someone who has a military background, and someone who is a teacher, and someone who is an engineer, right? Your business school classes are diverse groups, so you get these different perspectives. As you work on learning these skills, a good way to do it is to build a peer group. You can do this with your friends. You can have your company organize it as well. And as you tackle each of these topics, talk with other people. How do they approach it? How do they see this leadership challenge? How would they communicate this issue, which is different than yours, but you're all going to learn from each other. Even getting to the earlier pieces, like creating your career plan, or section 2 about how to do things like manage your manager or deal with corporate politics, that diversity of perspectives are going to help you formulate a much better approach as you tackle each of the questions.
Yeah, and soft skills certainly are not valued enough, especially when we're younger. We want to learn 1 and 1 equals 2. And the hard skills are taught, and they're taught mostly at school. And life quite often teaches us the soft skills, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Tell us, just to wind up here, let's touch on, before we finish, networking. What a lot of business people realize, sometimes slower than others, faster than others, is networking. Tell us a bit about what you think is really important in networking.
Here again, I think a mindset is key. And I was very lucky that I had read some books early on that changed how I thought about networking. Because most of us think about networking as, oh, I need a job. Okay, time to go to my network and I'll find a job. And then as soon as you have one, done with that. But in fact, networking is a mentality. It is about creating and utilizing this network continuously. And so I had read a book by someone, and he talked about anytime he had a problem, his network was his answer. He knew there's someone in his network who can help him. And so when you have this mentality, you start to say, oh, I have this great network. Yes, well, I need to find a job or a supplier, or learn more about this industry, or figure out what I want to do in my vacation to this country. Someone somewhere in my network has the knowledge I need. And you start to use your network as a daily tool. But of course, networking is not just about taking from your network, it's about giving. And you learn to also feed your network, to give back to your network on a daily basis. And when you do this, it becomes second nature. It becomes now just a natural process and something that's always available. It's almost, I think of it like our cell phones. It used to be, we'd say, okay, I had a computer, and well, if I need something online, I go into the computer room, I boot up my computer, I log on to the internet, and it was a lot of effort, right? But now we have the internet and our computers in our pocket. And for us to just say, oh, yeah, let me just pull up the information on my cell phone, right? It's a natural extension of who we are because we've lowered the level of engagement from when we had to boot a computer and log in. And if you treat your network like that old version, it's, okay, I have to go warm up my network, I have to go use it. It's not going to be as readily available. But when you get this mindset and have it as part of your daily activities, it's like carrying it in your pocket. It's always available at a moment's notice.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I remember going to some of the old breakfast networking events, and it's where you meet each other over breakfast. You all turn up in suits and ties. You hand out cards to each other, and typically the biggest problem with a lot of those is it's all about taking, not giving. And I think the biggest challenge we all have as humans to realize that you just got to keep giving and giving, and guess what? The opportunities will show up out of that. And for me, you meet a lot of people that have an agenda, and that agenda is to take something from you or to get something. And I think the mindset on that is very, very important, is that just give. And guess what? When you need them, 10 years later, you'll be surprised by what will show up and what gift you will be given then after you've been giving for maybe a decade. This is not about being used, that's for sure. But one of the main reasons I started this podcast was, and this is what tipped me over the edge after hiding the technology equipment in a cupboard for about 3 years, was one of the biggest gifts of podcasting is that it's about building relationships. And for me, I feel honored and grateful to be able to share your gift and skills and experience with the world. And for me, the podcast, the biggest gift it gives me is about giving attention to others and sharing their stories, because that's where I think the magic really happens.
That's 100% right. I think of networking as karmic.
Yep.
And you just keep giving, it will eventually find its way back to you.
Yep. And I started creating free content, 11 years ago. And people would say to me, "You're mad, you're giving all this away, giving away your IP." And I'm going, yeah, but it feels right. And guess what? The world showed up. That's what happened.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Mark, is there any sort of key takeaways you'd like to leave with our audience before we finish up here?
So first, a few things. If you'd like to learn more about the book or get in touch with me, if you go to the careertoolkitbook.com, you can find out about the book and where to buy it, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the usual places. But you can also download lots of free resources, including the app. So you can try this out and learn a little more about it. I would encourage you, if you're going to pursue these skills, to do so with other people. Mm-hmm. Because learning and getting that diversity of perspective is going to make it much more powerful and help folks. And of course, if you have questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. You can do so through the website.
Thanks, Mark, for that information. What we'll do is when we put it up on the website and the transcript and the intro, we'll have all the links for people there as well. Thank you very much, Mark, for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, and to hear your stories and hear your experience and what you've learned along the way. And I look forward to catching up in real life someday when things settle down and we can fly around the world again. I'm looking forward to that. So thank you very much. It's been an absolute honor to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.